I just wanted to introduce a basic idea that this book is a collective project. I think we started 2003. There were two reasons why we started. One was interaction with Roy Bhaskar, who was a philosopher of science, who first time suggested that the positivist epistemology should be broken and we should introduce a new idea, and that will open up its space for dialogue with Indian tradition. So that really ignited a lot of interest in our group in Delhi University. And then there was another person who said that with modernity, Indian people have not adjusted as yet. And he was talking about some culture in Bihar, in Mithila. So that ignited us, and we took a philosophical journey, went to the villages, and that project then started rolling, and we had few villages where we wanted to study. And then by the time I came to JNU, JNU gave us small funding, so which the money we never received. So it's all non-funded project. And a lot of friends came together. Akhlaq Saab from Persian, Suklaji from Sanskrit, Chaubezi from Professor Chaubey from Hindi, and few others. And we started with new this thing. In the meantime, Center introduced a paper on Indian knowledge tradition. And the point I wanted to make is that this book is actually part of that course. So more than 70% of the papers are term papers written by the young students, which developed into a full project. Say it took 3-4 years, and I'm really thankful to Shailja Tandon, who joined me in between, and she really did all hard work, including discussing constantly on the conceptual frames. And now Shailja and one of the students of that batch when we started this project, Deji Hajarika, who now has finished her PhD on one aspect of knowledge tradition in Assam from Oregon University. She and Shailja, they are coordinating this project called Knowledge and Practice in India, which in next couple of years we are planning to advance to with IIC. Want to make it Knowledge and Practice in Asia. So that is the background of this book. That much. Nothing about the book. We can then. Means that you should take your term papers seriously. Oh, your term papers are brilliant. Actually, you should insist on developing that into paper with comments from teachers, even after the course is over. That's the task.
Hope I'm audible to everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So when I was asked to review this book, I realized two things. Firstly, my limited knowledge of what now is understood as Indian knowledge system as compared to the breadth of this book would render many of my arguments necessarily acquiescent to the surge of proposition this work focuses to establish. Secondly, any critique that I can thus mount would be more in the nature of questions rather than a full-blown breakdown of the theoretical endeavor. So essentially, I'm calling you all to allow me some latitude. The Indian knowledge system, creative dialogue on intellectual tradition in the 21st century, edited by Professor Manindra Thakur and Shailja Tandon, finds itself as an initiative to open the knowledge space to reinstate the meditative flow by drawing on diverse Indian intellectual traditions within the Indian subcontinent and the rest of the world. This meditative flow, as Professor Thakur points out in his very first chapter, reflects the collective consciousness through time that has sustained an intense dialogic character amidst ruin or plenty. So he traces this evolution from philosophical dialogues in Vaishali to colonialism and its effort of epistemic violence, establishing a kind of a cross civilizational interchange as well as internal transformation at the same time. So it is the capacity of a civilization to absorb, contest and transform what it encounters while simultaneously negotiating its own internal differences. So a necessary intervention that the book makes here is to unpack this conceptual umbrella of Indian knowledge system and tradition. It not only foregrounds the need to engage seriously with India's philosophical and intellectual wealth, but also distinguishes this endeavor from two equally reductive impulses. So first would be the assertion of identity emerging from revivalist politics on one hand, and then on the other hand would be to recover an ostensibly authentic Indian intellectual tradition as a project of decolonization. And there's a large discussion on this in the book. I'm not spending a lot of time explaining what it is, but the book recognizes the dangers inherent in both these approaches and instead offers a more productive way of approaching the question, something the authors define as democratic negotiation. So we all are looking at a crisis unfolding in front of us. Uh, from the failure of economic systems to rise of populist right-wing governments across the globe, the imminent surge of wars and ecological disasters, to the extent inability of disciplines, including our own, to come with an answer or even capture and explain the scale of mindless devastation and moments of insipid losses. In such a situation of global philosophical crisis, the book posits one of its aims as search for a philosophy of future. It aims, and I quote, to question all universals to arrive at a better universal sensitivity to knowledge traditions in different parts of the world. It argues for engagement in debate, keeping universal human liberation as the judgmental criterion. Further, the term Indian knowledge system in our times is often seen as a meta concept, and the work brilliantly works at unpacking this. It explains the distinction between singular system and plural traditions, pointing towards a diverse and complex structure, connecting India's various schools of thought, having shared concepts, categories, and methods. And this would bring to my first question. The very idea of a system seems to presuppose a boundary that demarcates a within and a without. A within that sustains certain shared understanding of concepts and methods and something that we know, and a without which is unknown, unexplored, and oftentimes alien. So, however porous or fluid or even harmonious these boundaries are, these boundaries nevertheless are constitutive of what a system is. To speak, therefore, of an Indian knowledge system necessarily raises the prior question of what constitutes Indian in such formulation. Is the category to be defined geographically, temporally, civilizationally, or through a combination of these? And I would particularly like the professor to dwell on this question of how the category of Indian itself is constituted and what conceptual and methodological consequences would follow from adopting one definition over another. Further, I looked at the book as four broad clusters of chapters rather than individual chapters. These clusters for me would move from philosophical epistemology to embodied hermeneutics and sacred experience to then political ethics and finally to indigenous life world. And read against the framework established in the introduction in chapter 1, each cluster offers a different side through which the proposed meditative flow can either be observed or be tested. So in the first cluster, I read chapters on Lokayata, Kashmir Shaivism, ritual hermeneutics, and Sikh philosophy. And this would take us to the most explicitly philosophical domain of the volume. Here we see contributors attempting to free classical philosophy from a static idealistic reading, whether through Pathak and Katot's rehabilitation of Charvak materialism as an anti-caste, body-centric ontology, Alka Tyagi's contrast between Shankaracharya's static illusionism and Kashmir Shaivism's dynamic world-affirming philosophy, or Varun Vikmal's linking of Sikh non-duality to modern panpsychism and quantum mind theories. And I really found chapter 4 very interesting, where Todaria deepens the terrain by formulating a ritual hermeneutics, where the physical body itself becomes the interpretive site. And moving on towards the second cluster, I read Akhlaq Ahmad Khan's analysis of Darashiko's Majma ul Bahrain. Alongside this, Deepanjali Deka and Shruti Sharma trace how Kabir's Nirgun poetry and Sufi Qawwali operate as lived practices, negotiating the boundary between an outer ritual and inner experience, as well as a spatial shift from sacred shrines to commercialized secular stages. In the third cluster, this could include political ethics, textual conduct, and aesthetics. And here, political conduct and action are re-evaluated through Malayali Sanskrit theatre tradition of Kudiyattam and Bengal's Kartabhaja tradition. It also offers a critical rereading of animal fables in Panchtantra to rethink of political realism, alongside Mahabharat to formulate a triadic framework of justice. Especially on the chapter on Panchtantra, I found it particularly interesting because the author unsettles a conventional hierarchy between classical text and other texts. So, classical text as Niti Shastra or Sanskritic text versus texts that are read more as stories. And this uh, places a fresh reading of Panchtantra as Niti Shastra or at least a version of Niti Shastra that are not didactic but teach how to think rather than what to think. Towards the fourth cluster, the volume leaves classical texts and enters a live world of indigenous and Adivasi communities. The chapters on indigenous knowledge tradition in Kerala and Assam foreground non-codified forms of knowledge, particularly around health, where the body cannot be separated from history, culture, belief, behavior, and worldview. The discussion on Adivasi communities similarly questions the modern tendency to recognize knowledge only when it conforms to established categories of scientificity or rationality. This is significant because it expands the meaning of an intellectual tradition itself, which then would bring to my second question. So, in foregrounding indigenous and Adivasi knowledge as repositories of alternative epistemology, do we not risk rendering these communities that sustain these traditions as historically fixed subjects? So, there's a possibility that in our attempt to recover and legitimize what has been marginalized, we may inadvertently produce an image of the Adivasi as a bearer of an inherited, relatively stable body of knowledge, rooted in a certain kind of a relationship with land, health, or ecology, or however we may define that, rather than as lived and changing political communities. So we are placing a community that we are supposing it to become a stable community or thinking of it in terms of a fixed subject. So put differently, can indigenous knowledge be recognized without simultaneously romanticizing the subject as its timeless custodian? This would then also take me to the question of power. Professor Thakur explicitly acknowledges in the volume that all knowledge systems have darker sides, as power relations would mediate them. Yet, as I read across the volume, there appears to be a certain hesitation in applying this critical lens with equal force to classical traditions that the book seeks to recover and place in contemporary conversation. So, individual chapters certainly engage in questions of political ethics, justice, aesthetics, and even social relations within the classical text. But one is left wondering whether the volume could have more systematically confronted the ways in which some of these textual traditions have historically participated in, say, caste hierarchy or patriarchy. If the project is to move beyond both the romanticization of the past and rejection of Indian traditions as inherently oppressive, then would democratic negotiation not require us to hold both their emancipatory possibility and their histories of exclusion within the same analytical framework? Finally, I would return to the metaphor of flow with which the book begins. A flow is valuable precisely because it allows encounters to produce transformation. The real promise of this volume, therefore, may lie not in recovering an Indian knowledge system as something that is already complete, but in creating the conditions for a knowledge space in which every tradition, including those we seek to recover, is capable of being questioned, transformed, and renewed. I began by asking some latitude because I felt that any review I offered should not take form of a definitive judgment. Having read the volume, I think that may not be a bad position to occupy after all. The book is committed to dialogue, and contestation and democratic negotiation perhaps deserve to be reviewed not by closing conversations around it, but by opening to few more questions. And if the volume's larger ambition is to search for a philosophy of the future, then perhaps its success will ultimately be measured not by whether it gives us a final Indian knowledge system, but by whether it enables us to imagine more democratic ways of producing knowledge itself. Thank you. That would be all.
Ansi, for opening more diverse dialogue and floor for me to engage further. Now, while she has talked about tradition and rather taken a framework of tradition and systems, I would rather engage beginning to look at the two perspectives, that is of identity perspective and also the indigeneity one. So the book by itself dwells into various traditions, values, and ideas that constitute the pluralistic and diverse nature of Indian knowledge system. Right from idealism deriving from moral values imparted in the Gita and Mahabharata to materialist traditions of Lokayat or the Charvakas. From decoding Kashmir's Vijana Bhairav Tantra's esoteric texts employing tools of interpretations beyond Gadamer's hermeneutical analysis to employing tools of eclectic traditions within Sikhism through medium of quantum physics and philosophy of mind. Now, book's engagement with Dara Shiko's virtuous approach to knowledge within interaction and rather going beyond the didactic traditions of Hinduism and Islam, representing an Indo-Persian knowledge heritage. And Qawwali through institutions, language and literature forms part of this syncretic ritual tradition in the subcontinent. To its focus, folklores and theatrics of Natya Shastra, right from Kudiyattam to Panchtantra and then therefore to Mahabharata, uncovers a gamut of oral, lived and textual epistemologies. This is what the book has tried to bring together through rich sources of knowledge addressing the contemporary global crisis. Now, the contemporary global crisis emanates from the very idea of egocentric individualism, which the book has also talked about and referred to. Now, this egocentric individualism comes from unflinching hyper-capitalism, which has spread across globe and which people through works like How Democracies Die or Thomas Piketty have talked about how democracies are facing backsliding, at the same time economies are facing the worst of its crisis with various kinds of problems the society is going through, and therefore the ethical degradations, as Rajiv Bhargav had talked about in today's time, is the collapse of moral universe, where it's not just the erosion of moral judgment, but it's also the erosion of moral emotions that we can see today. Now, the crisis today roots from the self-centered individualism having its origin within the Anglo-American tradition of Western political theory, which situates individual at the center point of the philosophy, positioning itself as an abstract relation with community and society. On the other hand, we see the Indian tradition talking about individual located within the locus of society and community. So there is no hierarchy. Even Gandhi, when we see, would talk about this oceanic circle where there is an interchange and an interrelation with the social and the individual. And therefore we have thinkers like Tilak Aurobindo and Raja Ram Mohan Roy redefining through Neo-Vedanta and Vedantic traditions further, as other thinkers would do. Now, this genesis of Indian philosophical tradition contrasts in this manner with the West, and the gamut of work that this book by Professor Thakur and Shailja Tandon edited version has tried to do through 15 chapters and tries to answer these crises in various ways. Now, the question here is not just of why there is a need of engaging with Indian intellectual tradition, but at the heart of it also lies how we need to engage with it. And therefore, we have chapters like hermeneutics where we just try to go beyond the Gadmerian idea and to talk about sadhana. Now, this is a way where you could deal with traditions and various kind of esoteric symbolism that goes around various texts that would include Savagism and at times also Tantricism, which is most practiced around West and various northern frontiers. And at various times there have been a need to talk about Indian political philosophy. Right from McIntyre in back days had talked about the impoverished nature of the Western philosophy without having a dialogue with Indian theoretical tradition, or Maurice John questioned the parochialism inherent in the Western thought that came with the lack of intellectual engagement with Indian thinkers like Gandhi, who blended Indian and Western thoughts beautifully. Now, the question that we are grappling with today has also been pointed out with people like Yogendra Yadav and Peter D'Souza, who have brought in the debate of understanding and how Indian tradition perhaps need to be rethought, reworked to understand the grappling issues of democracies as we answer today. It's not that it's dead, but it needs to be revived and re-talked about and discussed perhaps in this kind of a platform as we do today. The book attempts answering these two questions, why and how. First, discussing identity assertion, where knowledge has been used as a tool to assert dominance and superiority, and therefore at times also a way of valorizing, which brings me to the next point, which talks about the idea of indigeneity. Now, indigeneity itself falls into the danger of valorizing and therefore having an exclusionary practice, which for a very long time has been thought about as a danger, and also one of the practices that had been attributed to Indian knowledge system or traditions and its work. Now, this book takes a fresh approach from the previously done work, which is based upon these two. And beginning from chapters like Lokayat by Devnath Pathak and Apurva Katoch, they have talked about materialism and rejection of supernaturalism. And this material tradition comes from this idea of agriculture and the combination with ayats. This also suggests that there could be potential for methodological innovations if Lokayat is read in equitable conjunction with debates on science and arts understanding located in the framework of Western modernity. And this is where we say how the Indian political tradition or Indian philosophical tradition needs to be done. I think to partly this book answers that question of how as well. The chapter 4 beautifully talks about embodied hermeneutics in savagism, and therefore coming forward, I think one of the most interesting chapters, or the as Mansi talked about clusters, would be the discussion that book opened up for Niti, Nyaya and Dharma, which started not just with Mahabharata, or rather located itself in Mahabharata, but started with talking about a Natya Shastra tradition of Kudiyattam. Now, most of these Natya Shastra traditions or practices are looked upon as having Brahminical pinch to them, whether we look at the northern ideas or the tradition or dance practice or music, where it starts from the Pandit or having a dancer which is compiled or which works on the Natya Shastra tradition of Brahminism or just upper caste. However, Kudiyattam, to a very large extent, to my understanding, as the chapter discusses, unlocks this and talks about how even basic tenets of social and gender justice has been evolved as a form of resistance in several forms in a deeply casteist society. Now, coming to the chapter of Panchtantra, which I think for the readers would be a delight and also a fresh way of looking at how Indian political traditions has to go beyond reading Vedantic traditions or maybe didactic texts like Manusmriti, Mahabharata that we have been doing all of the while. Values of friendship, compassion, empathy, talked about with animal fables where the lion is always the king or the foxes, has been able to give a ground to how human relation and conduct need to be done in society in day-to-day life. While it was talked there to impart knowledge to the five princes, here it's also for us to learn and therefore unpack these learnings in how we as individuals can take conducts. And followed by Suhasini Das's chapter on Niti, Nyaya and Dharma, which investigates political justice in Mahabharata. Now, this chapter, to my surprise, also talks about reinterpretation of Mahabharata to television serials, which I think is a new or a fresh look at how we can look at even texts as old as Mahabharata, as sacred as Mahabharata, because most of us have been looking to deal within the originality. Often, the current engagements with it, whether it's through social media or television, has been looked past, and we don't look at that. And therefore, here the author of this chapter has been able to engage with it, and shlokas of dharma like Yada Yada Hi Dharmasya, with Krishna's teaching of Arjuna, unfolds the exposition of individual dharma and collective nyaya in climatic moments of Draupadi's Stirhanan. Here, Niti has been put forth as a major realigner, and also has been able to realign itself with dharma and nyaya, and which has opened doors to newer ways of looking at all three concepts, that is dharma, niti and nyaya. Provides a range of engagement that reflects metaphor of mediative flow in Indian knowledge space that rejuvenates that civilization has to flow like a river, as Tagore has said and Professor Thakur has already talked about in the book. And I think these are the chapters, and this is the flow, the way they have been able to talk about, not just with classical text, but of course with fables, have been able to do justice to them and provide an open and knowledge space of mediative flow. Further, the book's core idea of viewing cross-fertilization of chapters from Shabhas of Vaishali, Indo-Greek to Indo-Arabs, moves beyond questioning the perspective, moves beyond questioning identity, assertion and indigeneity, engaging with influence of Sufism, deep-rooted Sanatan and other non-Islamic traditions, influence of Dara Shikoh's thought and spirituality, contributing to Asian knowledge tradition, which has been highlighted through the book. And therefore, Shruti Sharma's work on Qawwali transcending materialism comes not just as a differential point with other heterodox sects, but also moves beyond the constructed ritualistic practices originating in religious texts and religions like Hinduism and Islam, which talks about rather connecting to divinity, as Qawwali would talk about. Here, as Khankas going in and out has been concentrating about. Now, the third perspective is where I would like to raise some of the questions, and I find it having certain problems from where I would like to raise my question. So, right from Vedas, Upanishads, and Buddhist sabhas, most of these traditions, as the book talks about, is a way of democratization or democratic knowledge production. However, for a society which is deeply entrenched into social inequalities of caste, how do you see that democratic participation of where in democracy the basic tenet starts from having individual divinity and equality? However, when it comes to a society where there's deeply entrenched inequalities and subjugation based upon ideas like pollution, how do you see that democratic participation and negotiation happening? That is one. Further, I would like to ask, while we engage and contrast with Western traditions, one of the points that Western traditions has got right now is that the language of rights and liberty as products of enlightenment has become a common point of utility as answer to the prevailing questions and prevailing injustices of today's time. And therefore here my question is directed to, how do you see the languages and values and terms of Indian knowledge system being articulated in the everyday dialogues and practices among the genuine common man public sphere? So I leave my questions there. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you.
Yeah.
I'm happy that these sessions are getting more support and it's getting more engaging, especially because of the presence of the discussants who are actually our PhD scholars. And so it's so heartening to see that you are engaging with the text so seriously and so deeply. So what we do now is we give Professor Thakur to respond to A, his own observations with regard to this book, and B, respond to your queries first, and then we'll open the house for others to ask their questions.
Thank you very much. I think I must acknowledge that, in fact, we thought of dedicating the book to the students, which probably they missed, the publisher missed that. And I'm sure the way...
You can do that before the South Asian edition comes.
I will do that. Because, both your comments are so good. And I was recalling my classrooms when they were presenting those papers, and we were hours and hours we had discussions on these papers, and the way the papers have really grown. I must say that I have learned more than I would have contributed to the students, because this was the process of learning. I started this paper, started teaching for the first time, the way they received it. So both, I think both of you have done wonderful work. Let me begin by saying 2-3 things. One, that, as I said, this entire project started in 2003 after having a long discussion with Roy Bhaskar, who was a philosopher of science. So there are now 4 perspectives I'm locating on Indian knowledge system. First perspective is that of Mirananda. And I want to bring that because I have heard your comment on that. And I would request to look at that perspective from an angle of different philosophy of science. Because he is also using a philosophy of science to critique Indian intellectual tradition and say that there is nothing there. So there's an entire school of thought which thinks that knowledge that has emerged after enlightenment, that is the final knowledge. And that has to civilize the world. So all these other traditions are not very useful. They must go away. I think I would not agree with that. And would not agree with that, not because it is our knowledge within quote, because of the philosophy of science. Because the way Bhaskar organizes his argument, and he says that there are 3 stages of science. First stage, which argued that regularity is necessary condition for science and sufficient condition for science. Second stage, which said regularity is a necessary condition for science, but not sufficient condition for science. And third stage, which Bhaskar argued in his book, Realist Theory of Science, that regularity is neither a necessary condition and nor a sufficient condition for science. That opens up a Pandora's box for engaging with non-European traditions. That is the beginning of this. Other 2 approaches that I'm questioning, one is, of course, the identity assertion approach, which has no commitment to the knowledge per se, which has commitment to the identity politics. So in a way, it is a very utilitarian way of using knowledge tradition within which people are embedded to mobilize them for a political purpose. That doesn't serve the purpose of the knowledge. And second one, which is indigeneity approach, that this is post-colonial and all. The problem with them also, as I was mentioning to Amit this morning, I won't take the name now publicly, but a professor who is one of the exponents of this, I asked him that last 30 years we have been telling us that colonialism has ruptured our thought process and we are not able to articulate it properly. Epistemic violence has happened. But every time I go with you to some extent, then you take a U-turn. And he told me that, do you take coffee? I said, yes. And he took me to the coffee house and then said that Indian scholars have a fear. And this fear factor I discovered in many people. You will be surprised if you look at the history of philosophy, Indian philosophy, all the book, not 1 or 2, all of them will start with this idea that we do have a philosophy. And after 50 years probably, Bhikhu Parekh has accepted that we do have philosophy. Then he said, but we don't have theory. So now there are 3-4 major writings, one by Neeraj Chandok. Recently, Rajiv Bhargava in his book, What is Political Theory? Then Akash Singh Rathore and Parekh's famous article on that. All of it, Partha also on political theory. So all of them are now wondering whether we have political theory or not. My simple question, very layman's question is that if Rajiv is saying in his book in the beginning itself, the human beings are concept framing beings, isn't it? And then you are saying we don't have concepts. So are we not human beings? I mean, how can a civilization which has survived for 5,000 years with very strong state at various stages without a theory of justice? It just can't happen. It just can't happen that you have a strong state without theory of a state. It just can't happen that you have a theory of a state without theory of power. Maybe what we need to investigate, that do different civilizations articulate their theories differently, not in the same way as the modern West has articulated, and the language that they have used. most of these people whom I'm talking about, they are trying to seek theory in Indian tradition only through the lens of the Western definition of theory. Rajiv Bhargav has given 6 characteristics of theory. That is a typical Western theory. Or Parekh says that all Indian political theories should go to West first, train themselves in political theory, then come back and do Indian political theory.
Poverty of Indian political
Poverty of Indian political theory. So these are, I think, disturbing things which disturbed us during 2003. So I kept asking professors like Professor Ranveer Singh that what is there in Indian political theory, Indian political thought. He said that nothing is there. Towards the end of his life, I asked him, what is your unfinished project? And he said, if I get another life, I will try to study Indian philosophy. I have not done that. So probably that was the reason why we were getting into it. So that was the indigenous thing. And the third one, so rejection, identity assertion, and the indigenous thing. Fourth one, we are trying to articulate. I'm not sure if that articulation is final. It's still tentative. I've been testing about this. Democratic negotiation. By democracy doesn't mean majority and minority. Democracy means that giving importance to the knowledge itself. And there are criteria for deciding which knowledge is more adequate. One, on the ground of knowledge itself, plus on the ground of whether it's a liberative for people or not. If knowledge is not liberative for people, then we don't need to consider that as knowledge. There could be a lot of knowledge which cannot be liberative for people. So that is not knowledge in it. So therefore, that is one thing I wanted to say. On the issue of meditative flow and knowledge space, this is a new formulation we have designed, taking from Tagore, thinking that after all, what happens in a civilization which has lived for so long, when different ideas were produced, do those ideas die or they survive? If they survive, how do they survive? And what do people do with that? So one of the field works that I'm 2 villages that I have picked up for field work, and Professor Chaube is here, who is part of our project. He has done field work in Buxar, where he looks at 5 spaces where still some celebration is being done about 5 different intellectual traditions. So how do they survive and what do they do with that? In one of the villages where I keep going is a Nyaya village, where Nyaya philosophy survived for almost 1,000 years. Hundreds of books have been written in the same village on Nyaya philosophy. I was talking to Ganeri, who writes, Jonathan Ganeri, who writes on Nyaya. He did not even have idea that there is something like that. There is some village where these texts were written. My point is that if you want to read the text, and that's a hermeneutical point, if you want to read the text, do you read the text in isolation with the theory of hermeneutics, or do you read the text in the context of practice? Because once you read Nyaya tradition with the context of, in the context of text only, you will easily argue that a theory like Nyaya also has certain concept of Ishwar or God. But if you go to the field and start working there, then you will discover that it has nothing to do with Ishwar. It's a logic system through which they were solving their problem. So this idea of knowledge and practice is an epistemological idea, that knowledge has to be seen in the form of practice. A theory could be very liberative, but in practice that could be very oppressive. That is one of the dualities created in the West. So you will find somebody writes fantastic text on democracy, and in person that person is extremely undemocratic. So people write on multiculturalism. In person they are against monoculture. So these are the problems that you face. So this is also theoretical practice. Then knowledge space. So we said that probably, and taking this idea from Carl Jung, who talks of the collective consciousness, probably even a society, in a very porous meaning, has certain collective consciousness. That is the argument from Carl Jung and also from the text called Vigyan Bhairav, which argues that on consciousness itself, collective consciousness itself is an ontological layer. Like economy is an ontological layer, polity could be an ontological layer. So collective consciousness also is an ontological layer, which Tagore talks in his book called Sadhana that how do you access that ontological layer? You can't easily access that. Like if we assume that there is an ontological layer of political philosophy, so everybody cannot access that. You have to go through Amir Ali's class to access that. Otherwise, you can't access that. So therefore, this accessing the collective consciousness itself is a thing, but what happens there? So whatever political phase we see at the ground level happening, in those political phases, several ideas are produced. And those ideas become accumulated in the collective consciousness. And they remain there for a long time. And people reclaim that as and when they need that. That is the resource. That is the resource of humanity as a whole. It is not a community resource. So, take for example, 6th century BC, Vaishali. I always start with Vaishali, not because I'm from Bihar, but that was really a creative space. Imagine 10 kilometers radius, where Mahavir Jain, Gautam Buddha, Ajit K. Kambal, and so many others were living and debating. And their everyday life was involved in that. And there was a lot of philosophical conflict. And a philosophy that emerged within Jain tradition called Anekantvad. Now that Anekantvad became suddenly very popular when Gandhi declared that I am Anekantwadi. And he said that my entire theory of Satyagraha comes from Anekantvad. Or when Mahalanobis, who was the chairman of statistics association,
5-year plan.
5 years.
second five, but he was the first statistical association of the world. He was chairing that, and they were asking that where do you get a philosophical support for statistics? And Mahalanobis delivered a very big lecture on Anekantvad. That lecture is available online. One can have a look at that. So, which means that the ideas produced in different societies that become part of the collective consciousness that remain there. Now we call that a knowledge space. We may call something else also, I'm not sure, but at the moment we want to call it knowledge space. And then Tagore's this metaphor is very interesting when he says that these knowledge spaces in different societies get blocked. People stop accessing them. So somebody like, this is what he says about Ram Mohan Roy. If somebody like Ram Mohan Roy comes and looks at that blockage and opens that up. So Ram Mohan Roy, I think, if you look at the Sati debate, how did he open this meditative flow is very interesting, because he was not taking help from Western logic. He was refuting religion by religion. That very interesting framework that he offers, that becomes the framework for the entire movement actually. The contribution of Ram Mohan Roy is that he developed a framework of internal critique that remained a very powerful technique for doing it, and that he reclaimed from Nyaya tradition. Nyaya tradition was actually about that, about critiquing. So I think this idea of flow and meditative flow and knowledge space can be very helpful in accessing and evaluating these things. Third thing we said that against any idea that Indian knowledge system means Sanskrit tradition. In fact, I suggested Professor Kapil Kapoor, when he was talking of Indic Center, that you should introduce Persian in that also. Persian is as Indic as Sanskrit, I guess. So he said, no, Persian can't be included. I keep debating with him on this. So I think Indian, when you say what is Indian, and Hilal raised this question, I've mentioned his name in the book also, and we have been meditating on this. I think Indian is not one tradition. It has never been one tradition. There are traditions and traditions, and the river metaphor is very interesting. Not that there is a mega river which consumes everything, but river means kind of flowing space where others come together and then create a new flow. Then you don't know where are they separately. So you see a lot of debates happening all through. I have mentioned some of them. This is not the exhaustive list. If somebody can only work on this, that how many times in India such Sangam has taken place, where new philosophies have come and disturbed everything, then the new articulation takes place. There are n number of them in different areas. I have just taken some mega signposts to show that how when the Greeks came first time there was a major change in the Nyaya tradition. The Nyaya tradition was teaching three-stage logic, which we are using from Greek society. That was, if wherever there is a fire, there is a smoke. Wherever there is smoke, there will be fire. So that's a conclusion that we do most of the time. I got this story from the village, which said that Gautam, who is the founder of Indian Nyaya, he was teaching the same Nyaya, and his wife came from kitchen with a mud full of smoke and broke that mud and asked him, "Here is the smoke. Where is the fire?" Then he modified that logic and said that five-stage logic, which is now wherever there is a fire, there is smoke. Wherever there is smoke, there is a possibility of fire. Then you have to empirically evaluate that, whether the fire is there or not. And that has produced a lot of jokes in that area. I've collected so many jokes about the Naiyics because they are the realists. So this is how I think things have grown. There are several pages of such debates I have picked up. And Darashiko, of course, was one. We all know that how this time the new debates were happening. But not only that, in the entire Greek world, there's a very interesting book by Machiavelli. I mean, probably you have seen that book. Who writes? The title of the book is "Structures of Ancient Thought." He's an art historian who examines how Indian philosophy reached to Greek society and what was the impact of that there, and later on how Greeks impacted India. So even at that level, somewhere in Iran, there used to be a big market where Indian tradition used to reach with medicine, and medicine and philosophy were not different at that time. That's how there was whole debate that started there. Or the entire Central Asia, as political philosophers or theorists or whatever we call ourselves, we have not even examined the big debates that have happened in Asian tradition between Buddhism and Islam, or Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. We don't even know about the authors. So I think that if we look at this history from that angle, then we will come to know that how there has been a massive dialogue. So it is not one tradition, it is many traditions. And therefore, the system that you say, system for me is a fuzzy thing, not very rigid thing, but interconnected. Why I'm calling this system? Because they have been raising certain set of questions which are probably different than other civilizations. And I'm talking not of India only. India is, for me, not a nation state, not a geographical boundary. I'm talking India means this cultural space, which includes Rumi, which includes, like I have tried to see the impact of Gandhi in Pakistan. Very interestingly, there is a serial, you must watch that. Main Manto To Nahi, a Pakistani serial. And you can see Gandhi is speaking there. So probably this entire zone, cultural zone, has been such that it has different kinds of questions that it has raised. It has question about ethics. Ethics and politics is so much interconnected in this area, which is not connected in the West in the same way. Questions that we ask about the self and the society, probably that connection is not there. So maybe in some form they could be there. I don't want to essentialize, but I think this has been very prominent there. So therefore, this is a system where we are talking about these things, and answering one question will impact the other answer to the other question. And this is not a monolithic system. There are many traditions. There are traditions within traditions. And interestingly, most of the Indian traditions are always practicing traditions. So you have a philosopher, then the philosopher has a school, then the school has followers, and they are practicing. And probably philosophy dies and the followers remain there. Then you treat them as sect. So this has been so much in Indian context that one should see why, after all, this question always comes to my mind, Amit. Why, after all religions, bigger religions, most of them, emerged in Asia? Asia. Why? And if they have emerged in Asia, is there an impact of that on our thought process? Is it that we are so embedded in that most of Indian thinkers, even Ambedkar, who was of course suffering Hinduism, never said that we must ban religion. It was very easy for Soviet scholars, Soviet thinkers to say that ban religion, but never for Indian thinkers, even at that time. So these are the questions that one can raise if one looks at the tradition, Indian intellectual tradition or knowledge system as fuzzy, not as a nation state within boundary, but as a cultural space where we are surviving, of which there is a knowledge space in which these debates have been taking place, and resurgence of debate you will find every now and then happening on these issues. The question of power and asymmetrical relationship, let me acknowledge that this book has emerged accidentally. It was not a planned book. As I told you that. Probably that's why I'm very happy that we did not tell anybody what to write. We didn't give any instruction what to write, except that it was a discursive community. I mean, I knew their work from very beginning when they started. And continuously we kept talking for hours and hours on their work, including Panchtantra and Suhasini, who is the youngest probably in the lot. So we kept talking about that. So I could see that there is a kind of link, but I would not even try to have a very defined link. I did not try that. Therefore, you will find that there are gaps in the book. And very soon we are working on the second volume. Professor Chaube has a very interesting article in that on Jaisi. On tribal issue, I'll come to that point. So there are many more articles coming up. So second volume will be probably slightly planned. And I'm fearing also that if we plan that, that will become a rigid framework. We are contemplating on this. How do you look at the power? But if you remember Rakesh's article, which is about Kerala and Assam medicine system. So he was on the Dalit tribes' knowledge tradition, or their knowledge tradition about medicine, which is very, very strong. Or the other village I work in Assam is called Mayang, which is a notorious village in the British record. They call it village of black magic. But when I met them, start talking to them, they are saying it is white magic. So it's a healing system. They have their own knowledge, which is of course intertwined with some kind of spirituality and other things. But mainly what they claim is that they have idea of the herbs that they work with. So, or tribal, Shailja is now working on Jharkhand. The tribal knowledge system, a group is being formed on tribal knowledge system. So I think a lot of gaps are there, which probably will be filled up. Like I want somebody to read Murdaiya just from this angle, that how much knowledge that community had of herbal medicine. This text, I think at least 50 such references you will find that how his grandmother was providing herbal medicine to the people. So probably a lot of other things we can, or when Gopal Guru talks about the knowledge of child delivery that the Dalit community has, right? So probably all this is knowledge and powerful knowledge, and maybe cheaper than what we get with the modernity. So that is the gap we would like to fill up gradually. But we are very conscious of it, that all such knowledge traditions, including the tribal knowledge system, also simultaneously has been mediated through power. So we should never try to think that these knowledge systems are so great that they were always liberative. As you rightly said, that there are two dimensions, emancipatory and oppressive. And the whole idea is to move from a religion of rules to religion of principles. I think that is Ambedkar's formulation, which can be used in many places in the same way. On the tribal thing, two authors who one has contributed, other one is supposed to contribute. Two have contributed, and third is supposed to contribute in the next volume, who has worked with me. Neelam Kerkata, I guess you know. Brilliant work that he has done, and he treats tribal community not as a backward community left out in the development process that generally people think. He thinks it as an epistemic community.
Knowledge producers.
Of knowledge producers. And his PhD is on the knowledge system of tribals regarding environmental issues. And his argument is that the mainstream society, what we do, we provide one technological solution to the problem created by other technological solution. And therefore, we are getting into technological trap. Tribals over the centuries have developed their own method of protecting nature, which has to be seen as a knowledge system. That's his argument. Of course, that knowledge system is not documented. Is not. When he started his PhD, the biggest problem was in the faculty. Also, people asked him, "Where will you get the documents? What is the material you are working on?" So, what he did, he collected songs, stories, and so many other kinds of oral resources and the practices to argue that how this is an epistemic community. To be epistemic community means that you are very conscious that you are thinking in this way. It is not accidental that you are not killing an animal during the breeding season, even if you are dependent on the life of the animal. There is an epistemic frame within which you are operating all the time. So therefore, that is what I think would not consider tribals as. And in fact, the democratic negotiation would basically mean, and this is also a tentative term we are using, that all knowledge, this is my assumption, and very strong assumption on which I would like to further work, that all knowledge traditions, small or big, are product of human reflexivity. Reflexivity while trying to solve their problems. Now, whatever problem they are facing, they have better understanding of the problem and better solution that they find out. For instance, if there is a community which has grown in water scarcity area, they have developed all techniques of saving water. If the other area is also suffering from water scarcity gradually, should learn from the other community how to save water. So therefore, all communities have produced knowledge. All knowledge are common resource of humanity. And therefore, we should engage with the knowledge not through power structure. We should engage with knowledge through these two criteria. One, the judgment of knowledge, how far it is knowledge, so rationally examine whatever you want to do. And second, not only through experimentation, but through other epistemologies of knowledge. And second, whether it's liberative or not. These are two criteria on which you can evaluate or decide to have a kind of dialogue on traditions. So if it is liberative, it will not be marketable. So what is happening today is that capital is acquiring traditional knowledge and market that with a new packaging, and people are losing that. We do not have any well-formed intellectual property right for the community property, community knowledge. All property right is about individual knowledge, the individualized knowledge. The only place where you will find a community property right, knowledge right, is Kerala. The left government once upon a time formulated that, and that is how the Ayurvedic system doesn't belong to any individual. It is a kind of Kerala's collective property. So probably we need to work on that. And we are engaging with governments these days, suggesting that you must map your knowledge traditions and give a collective property right to that. So I am in dialogue with Professor Anil Gupta from IIM Ahmedabad, who has been doing this kind of work, and had a long discussion with him how to formulate this community right. But tribals, so much of, and very interesting thing in tribal knowledge system is there, the ethics of knowledge. An anthropology professor from JNU, a student of JNU, told me that his father has knowledge of one herbal medicine which can help a normal delivery in certain circumstances. And he kept arguing with his father that please give me this knowledge. His father said, you are not eligible for that. You will start earning money from this. So much of strong ethics attached with that. If you go to Mayong, if they want to, a lot of companies are going there, asking them to give that herbal medicine. They can develop that into a package and sell that. They are not giving that. They are saying this is a community property. The day I will start selling it off, I will lose the knowledge. That's a normal tribal understanding about the knowledge. So I think therefore we have to respect all traditions of knowledge, but not that we do not scrutiny that. We examine them through various epistemologies, including the epistemology of positivist modern science. There is no harm in that. But we take that seriously. We should not dump that like in Mayong for years and years. When I wanted to go to Mayong, my police officer friend told me that we had instructions to beat them up, snatch their text and burn the text as a police officer. So for centuries, I guess, several knowledge traditions which belong to people and they solve their own problem through those knowledge traditions were completely eliminated through the dominant knowledge tradition, and not for the reason that they were inferior knowledge traditions, partly for the reason that it was suiting the market, it was favoring the market. There are so many examples I have where the market tries to eliminate such people who can provide very cheap treatment of something. Sujata has been working on so many such projects. Madhulika Banerjee has been working on such projects. So this is what I think is important. So I think the other two, sorry, I'll take 5 more minutes. Uh, the conflict between different traditions. I do not assume that there were no conflicts. I think there were severe conflicts. However, I think the political conflict and intellectual conflict had different levels. Like some people suggest that between Brahminical knowledge system and Buddhist knowledge system, there was a massive violence, which I doubt. And the reason of doubt is very simple. The big Buddhist universities emerged and survived in Bihar, not during the Buddhist state. They emerged and survived during Gupta period. And Gupta period gave all kinds of grants. So knowledge space, I think, were relatively autonomous from the political space at that time. It is not like today that a state will tell us to conduct research of this kind or that kind, or will stop any kind of ideological discussion in the university. I think, as people say, that even the king, before entering the university, would leave the rath outside and then enter. So probably there was some autonomy. This is struggle. Now, for instance, Magad and Mithila in Bihar are two spaces close by, and I collected so many stories of big debates, public debates between the two, and they influence each other. 7th century, after long debate, Nyaya tradition got divided. One tradition got deeply influenced by Buddhism, and that became Navanyaya. And Navanyaya had to leave Mithila, and they went to Bengal. What is that area? Bengal's Navadvip area. So Amartya Sen, Sudipta Kaviraj, so many people come from the same area, Navadvip area. So these were, I think, creative moments also. These dialogues, struggles, intellectual struggles were also creative moments for creating new ideas. That was something that with that we started our project when we went for philosophical journey. Because what we found in the village, there were modernists, hardcore modernists, there were hardcore traditionalists, but there were people who were negotiating with tradition and modernity both. I have so many examples of the villages, and those were very interesting people. But they were discovering new arguments for being modernist in a way and not being modernist in other way. Probably human beings create new philosophies at that point of intellectual tension. So these tensions were at the intellectual space, creative tensions compared to violent political tensions. Of course, political conflict must have been there, I'm sure. But political conflicts, when they settle down, what survived for centuries was the knowledge interaction. That's how I would like to see that. Yes, Western tradition of rights and all that. I think, I have a student who has worked on water, Ruchi. You must be knowing Ruchi. So we were working on this concept that how does a movement begin related to natural resource and what is their perception of natural resource. Surprisingly, most of the examples we saw, the beginning of the movement always had this idea that resources are common. Then we discovered in Asian tradition, natural resources were never owned by anybody. In fact, Engels writes to Marx asking why the history of Asia looks like history of religion. And Marx replies him, because Asia does not have private property in land. The dialogue did not go further, but I'm sure somebody can research and find out what does that mean. So nobody owned resources. Everybody has right to use resources without destroying that. And there are so many examples we collected. For instance, in a village, somebody sold all his trees. And he was a landlord. And the villagers came to him and said that you can't sell off the trees. He said, why? This is my tree, our tree, we can sell off. He said, no, you can't because birds have been using that. We have been using that. So marked around 50 trees, said that you just can't cut them. You can use it, you take fruits, but you can't cut the tree. So these kind of perceptions are there in the common resources. I also try to think, where does the right discourse take us? Can there be some other way of looking at? So right discourse of property right has huge limitations. Similarly, Binish Mariam, she has worked on Gujarat rights. And she makes an argument, that's another perspective that we have developed gradually called social healing. He argues that the question she raised was that how do people live, two communities, after the right? What happens after that? She first worked on Bhagalpur right, then worked on Gujarat right. And she discovered that after the right, there is a rapprochement, a healing between them. For instance, Gujarat, the mosque was broken by Hindus, and then they collected resources to make the mosque again. In Bhagalpur. In Gujarat, he said that volunteers they came together, they started supplying food and work back. So society probably at the ground level have these kind of techniques of organizing. I mean, we have a book on social healing. We are now doing another project on social healing. And this project we started after 1990, after the Babri Mosque demolition. And we organized a couple of conferences. And this we argued that the question was that how do you think Asian society, despite being multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious, did not have war of religion as Europe? So we tried to map different institutions through which people negotiate among themselves. And we had several examples from Northeast, from Bihar, from different areas, how do they negotiate. So probably beyond right discourse, I don't think that right discourse should be abandoned. I think that the language of right, which is supported by the state. In fact, the state used the language of right to break the movements also. Like Ruchi has found out that when the movement picks up, the state starts asking who owns this land. And it starts picking up some people, and then individual cases begin. It is no more the community case. And then you break that. As happens in all the movements, the state does not pick up the whole people, will pick up some of them. Through now AI, they will locate who was speaking more and then pick that up. So that is where I think, beyond the right discourse, people's discourse is not right discourse, I think. Their discourse is more than right discourse. And the last point, what we really need to map, how do people live their life? And I just want to give an example. I don't think people live their life through the Rawlsian theory of justice. Do you think people in the villages know Rawlsian theory of justice and then they start behaving with themselves? No. They have their own idea of justice. And what is that? How do we map that? I give 3 examples. You look at any family, joint family, when it gets divided. How do they manage that division? There is some logic in that. There's a logic, there's a movie called Drishyam. And I watched that movie several times to see how people are responding to the movie. Very interestingly, whenever the person dodged the police, people clapped. And I used to sit in the front bench to see how those people were responding. The justice, legal justice, supported the police officer because her son was killed. But natural justice, that people were thinking justice was just, they're supporting the other one. Similarly, in one of the constituencies, I was doing my field work near Muzaffarpur, Bochaha constituency, 2015. A lady who won the election, she was independent, middle-aged lady. Her own caste community was around 3,000, and she had no money. So it was a big puzzle. What happened there? During the survey, everybody told me, उसके साथ तो अन्याय हुआ है, इसीलिए हम लोग उसको वोट करेंगे. अन्याय क्या था कि एक पार्टी ने उनको टिकट दिया और टिकट लास्ट डे विथड्रॉ कर लिया, because she didn't have money. So everybody across caste, community and class were telling me that we have to vote against this injustice. It means they have sense of justice and injustice through which they are working. Unless we map that, we will not understand how they are taking political decisions. On what ground? Therefore, political theorists are always surprised. Somebody in the morning said that in Bengal, Partha Chatterjee kept writing about something and the TG was saying something. So probably we are not able to map the way people organize their own life. And that's where we need to enter. And for that, the intellectual traditions which have survived there, which have been debated there, that constitutes their collective consciousness. They access that collective consciousness to reformulate their everyday life. If you want to understand that, we have to engage with intellectual traditions. I'll stop here. Thank you.